The summer heat pressed down on Brooklyn like a heavy blanket, making the air thick and hard to breathe. Mike Tyson walked slowly down the cracked sidewalk of his old neighborhood, his massive frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. He had come here to visit his childhood friend Marcus, but what he found instead would change everything. The sound hit him first, shouting, angry voices, the kind that made your stomach twist with worry. Mike quickened his pace, his heart starting to pound. As he turned the corner onto Fulton Street, he saw a crowd gathered around something, people pushing and pointing. The energy felt wrong, dangerous. Mike pushed through the crowd, using his size to move people aside. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 police officers surrounded a young black teenager, maybe 16 years old. The boy was on his knees, hand behind his head, shaking like a leaf. One officer had his hand on his weapon. The kid's mother stood nearby, tears streaming down her face, begging them to be gentle with her son. "Please, officers," the woman cried, her voice breaking. He didn't do anything wrong. He was just walking home from school. The lead officer, a tall man with cold eyes, ignored her completely. "Kid matches the description from the robbery report," he said to his partner. "Same clothes, same age, same everything." Mike felt something hot rise in his chest. He knew this scene too well. He had lived it himself as a young man in these same streets. The fear in the boy's eyes, the helplessness of his mother, the way the officers treated them like they were already guilty, it all brought back memories that never fully healed. The crowd around them grew larger, but everyone stayed back, afraid to get involved. Some people held up their phones, recording everything. Others whispered to each other, shaking their heads. But nobody stepped forward. Nobody wanted to risk making things worse. Mike watched the teenager's shoulders shake as he tried not to cry. The boy reminded him of himself at that age, scared, angry, and trapped in a world that seemed designed to work against him. The officers were getting more aggressive, their voices louder, their movements sharper. "Turn around." One officer barked at the kid. "Put your hands on the wall." The teenager tried to comply, but his legs were shaking so badly he could barely stand. His mother reached toward him, wanting to help, but another officer blocked her path. "Step back," the officer commanded. "Don't interfere with police business." "Here's my baby," she sobbed. "He's a good kid. He gets straight A's. He volunteers at the church. Please, you're making a mistake." Mike had heard enough. Every muscle in his body was tense, every nerve on fire. He thought about walking away, about minding his own business like so many others were doing. But then he looked at that kid again, saw the pure terror in his eyes, and knew he couldn't just stand there and watch. The crowd seemed to sense something was about to happen. Conversations got quieter. People turned to look at Mike, recognizing him even after all these years. Some whispered his name. Others pulled out their phones, sensing that something big was about to go down. Mike took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He knew that once he stepped forward, there would be no going back. This wasn't just about one teenager or one moment. This was about everything he had learned, everything he had survived, and everything he believed about standing up for what was right. The lead officer was reaching for his handcuffs, ready to arrest the boy for something he hadn't done. The teenager's mother was crying harder now, feeling helpless to protect her son. The crowd was getting restless, angry energy building like steam in a pressure cooker. Mike made his choice. He stepped out of the crowd and into the circle where the officers and the teenager faced each other. His movement was slow and deliberate, like a predator deciding to reveal itself. Every eye turned to him. The street seemed to hold its breath. "Excuse me, officers," Mike said, his voice calm but carrying the kind of power that made people listen. "I think there might be a problem here." The lead officer looked up, annoyed at the interruption. When he saw who was speaking, his expression changed completely. Recognition flashed across his face, followed quickly by uncertainty. This wasn't just some random citizen trying to interfere. This was Mike Tyson, and everyone knew what that name meant. The teenager looked up too, hope flickering in his frightened eyes. His mother stopped crying for a moment, wondering if maybe, just maybe, someone was going to help her son. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something historic was about to unfold. Phones were raised higher, recording everything. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Mike stood there, 6 feet tall and built like a mountain, his presence changing everything. The officers didn't know what to do. The teenager didn't know whether to hope or stay scared. The crowd didn't know whether to cheer or run. But Mike knew exactly what he was going to do. He had made his choice the moment he saw that scared kid on his knees. Now he just had to see it through, no matter what happened next. The confrontation was about to begin. The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Mike Tyson stood between the officers and the teenager, his presence transforming the entire scene. The lead officer, Detective Ray Sullivan, had been on the force for 15 years, but he had never faced anything quite like this. "Sir, this is police business," Sullivan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm going to have to ask you to step back and let us do our job." Mike didn't move. His dark eyes locked onto Sullivan's, and the intensity that made the officer's confidence waver. "Your job is to serve and protect," Mike said quietly. "Right now, I'm seeing a lot of scaring and very little protecting." The teenager, Jamal Williams, was still on his knees, but he was no longer shaking. Mike's presence had given him something he didn't expect to find. Hope. His mother, Angela, wiped her tears and stood a little straighter. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like someone was on their side. "We received a report about an armed robbery 3 blocks from here," Sullivan explained, his hand still resting on his weapon. "The suspect is described as a young black male, approximately 16 years old, wearing a red hoodie and jeans. This individual matches that description perfectly." Mike looked down at Jamal, taking in the red hoodie and jeans. Then he looked around the street, noting at least 5 other young men in the crowd wearing similar clothes. "Funny thing about descriptions," Mike said, his voice carrying an edge that made everyone lean forward to listen. "They tend to fit a lot of people when they're that general." The crowd murmured agreement. People nodded, understanding exactly what Mike meant. They had all seen this before. Young black men stopped, searched, and arrested based on descriptions so vague they could apply to half the neighborhood. Officer Martinez, Sullivan's younger partner, stepped forward. "Mr. Tyson, with all due respect, we can't just let suspect go because of who shows up to defend them. We have procedures to follow." Mike turned his attention to Martinez, and the younger officer immediately regretted speaking up. There was something in Mike's eyes that reminded everyone present why he had been called the most feared man in boxing. "Procedures," Mike repeated slowly. "Tell me about your procedures for determining guilt before innocence." "We're not determining guilt," Sullivan interjected, trying to regain control of the situation. "We're conducting an investigation." "With a kid on his knees and your hand on your gun." Mike's voice rose slightly, and the crowd pressed closer. "That doesn't look like an investigation to me. That looks like you've already made up your minds." Angela Williams found her voice. "My son was at school when this robbery happened," she said loudly, pulling a paper from her purse. "Here's his attendance record from today. He was in math class at the time you say this crime occurred." Sullivan barely glanced at the paper. School record can be faked. We need to take him in for questioning." That's when Mike's demeanor shifted. The crowd could feel it, a change in the air like the moment before lightning strikes. Mike had been calm, controlled, measured in his words. But something in Sullivan's dismissive tone flipped a switch. "Can be faked." Mike's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every person present. "You're calling this woman a liar to protect a lazy investigation." The third officer, Stevens, had been quiet until now, but he could see the situation spinning out of control. "Maybe we should call for backup," he muttered to Sullivan. Mike heard him. "Backup." He looked around at the crowd, which had grown to nearly 50 people. "You think you need backup to handle one scared teenager and his mother? Or is the backup for me?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Everyone understood what Mike was really asking. Were they going to escalate the situation just because someone had the courage to stand up to them? Jamal finally found his voice. "Mr. Tyson," he said quietly, "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just walking home from school, listening to music. These officers stopped me and made me get on my knees before they even asked my name." Mike looked down at the teenager, seeing himself 30 years ago. "What's your name?" "Son." "Jamal Williams. I'm 16. I live 2 blocks from here with my mom and my little sister." What do you want to be when you grow up, Jamal? The question surprised everyone, including Jamal. I want to be an engineer. I'm good at math and science. I have a 3.8 GPA. Mike nodded, then looked back at the officers. So let me understand this. You've got an honest student with documented proof he was in school during the robbery, but you still think he's your suspect because he's wearing clothes that half the kids in this neighborhood own. Sullivan's jaw tightened. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. The crowd was getting bigger and more vocal. People were recording everything. His supervisors were going to want answers, and he didn't have good ones. Mr. Tyson, I respect who you are and what you've accomplished, Sullivan said, but you can't interfere with a police investigation. I'm going to have to ask you one more time to step back. Mike smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Oh, what, detective? You're going to arrest me too? On what charges? Standing up for an innocent kid. The crowd stirred, energy building like water behind a dam. People were getting angry, fed up with watching this play out. Someone shouted, "Leave the kid alone." Others joined in, voices rising. Martinez looked nervous. Detective, maybe we should reconsider. The kid does have an alibi. But Sullivan had gone too far to back down now. His pride was on the line, and backing down in front of Mike Tyson and 50 witnesses felt like giving up his authority completely. The investigation continues, he said firmly. Jamal Williams, you're coming with us for questioning. That's when Mike stepped directly in front of Sullivan, close enough that their faces were only inches apart. The crowd went dead silent. Even the traffic seemed to stop. No, Mike said simply. He's not. The line had been drawn. On one side stood the police, backed by badges and legal authority. On the other stood Mike Tyson, backed by moral certainty and 50 witnesses. Between them knelt a scared teenager whose only crime was walking home in the wrong clothes at the wrong time. Everyone knew that what happened next would echo far beyond this street corner. The confrontation had moved from a simple case of mistaken identity to something much bigger, a test of whether power or justice would win the day. The tension was unbearable. Something had to give. The standoff stretched into its third minute, but it felt like hours. Mike Tyson and Detective Sullivan faced each other like two gunfighters in an old western, neither willing to back down. The crowd had swollen to over 100 people, drawn by social media posts and word spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. Mr. Tyson, Sullivan said through gritted teeth, you are now officially interfering with a police investigation. I'm ordering you to step aside, or I will place you under arrest. Mike didn't flinch. For what crime? Detective? Standing between you and an innocent kid? Since when is protecting someone a crime? Obstruction of justice, Sullivan shot back. Justice? Mike's laugh was cold and bitter. Where's the justice in arresting a kid because he fits a description that could match 1,000 people in this neighborhood? Where's the justice in ignoring proof that he was somewhere else when the crime happened? The crowd pressed closer, sensing the moment was reaching a breaking point. Angela Williams clutched her son's school records, tears streaming down her face. Jamal remained on his knees, afraid to move but no longer trembling. He watched Mike defend him with a mixture of awe and terror. Officer Martinez stepped forward, his hand moving toward his radio. Detective, we should call this in. Get some guidance from a captain. We don't need guidance, Sullivan snapped. We need compliance. He looked directly at Mike. Last warning. Step aside now, or you're under arrest. Mike spread his arms wide, making himself an even bigger barrier between the officers and Jamal. Then arrest me, but you're not touching that kid. The crowd erupted. People shouted support for Mike, cursed at the officers, and pressed forward despite Martinez waving them back. The situation was spinning out of control, exactly what Sullivan had been trying to avoid. Is protecting an innocent child, someone yelled from the crowd. Those officers should be ashamed, another voice added. Mike Tyson's got more courage than all of them put together. Sullivan's face was red with anger and embarrassment. He had never been in a situation like this, where his authority was being challenged so publicly and so completely. Every second he hesitated made him look weaker in front of the growing crowd. But Mike wasn't done. He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying over the noise like a bell. This is what happens when good people stay silent. This is what happens when we let fear keep us from doing what's right. That boy there, Jamal, he could be your son, your brother, your nephew. And if we don't stand up for him today, who's going to stand up for them tomorrow? The crowd roared approval. People were recording everything, posting live streams to social media. The hashtag #TysonStandsUp was already trending locally, with videos of the confrontation spreading across platforms. Angela Williams found her courage. She stepped forward, standing next to Mike. My son is a good boy. He works hard in school, helps with his little sister, volunteers at our church. He's never been in trouble, never even had detention. These officers are trying to destroy his life because they are too lazy to do real police work. More people began stepping forward. First one, then 5, then dozens. They formed a human wall around Jamal, with Mike at the center. The message was clear. If the officers wanted to arrest a teenager, they would have to go through all of them. Sullivan looked around desperately. He was outnumbered 50-1, and the crowd was growing larger and angrier by the minute. His hand hovered over his radio, but he knew that calling for backup would only escalate the situation further. Officer Stevens, the oldest of the 3, had seen enough. He walked over to Sullivan and whispered urgently in his ear, "Ray, we need to end this. The kid's got an alibi. We're making ourselves look like fools." Sullivan's pride warred with his common sense. He could see news vans arriving in the distance, drawn by the social media coverage. This was about to become a national story, and he was going to be at the center of it. Mike sensed the officer's uncertainty and pressed his advantage. "Detective Sullivan, you seem like a smart man. You've got a choice to make right now. You can admit you made a mistake and walk away, or you can try to arrest me and turn this into something much bigger than either of us wants." "And if I walk away?" Sullivan asked quietly. "Then you show these people that good cops can admit when they are wrong. You show them that the badge means protecting people, not bullying them. You turn a bad situation into a teaching moment." The crowd had gone quiet, sensing that negotiations were happening. Everyone leaned forward, straining to hear what the officers and Mike were saying. Sullivan looked at Jamal, really looked at him for the first time. He saw a scared kid, not a criminal. He looked at the school records in Angela's hands, proof that the boy was innocent. He looked at the crowd of neighbors who had come to support the family. And he looked at Mike Tyson, who had risked his own freedom to protect a stranger. "The description we got was pretty general," Sullivan admitted quietly. "It was," Mike agreed, "and this kid's got proof he was somewhere else. If we walk away, how do we know he won't run?" Angela stepped forward. "Officer, my son has lived in this neighborhood his whole life. His school is here, his family is here, his friends are here. Where would he run to? And why would he run if he's innocent?" Sullivan looked at his partners. Martinez nodded slightly, relief visible on his face. Stevens had already stepped back, distancing himself from a confrontation. The detective turned back to Mike. "If new evidence comes to light that contradicts his alibi, then you do real police work and investigate," Mike interrupted. "But you don't arrest innocent kids based on hunches and lazy descriptions." The crowd held its breath. News cameras were rolling now, broadcasting the confrontation live to the world. This moment will be remembered, analyzed, and debated for years to come. Sullivan made his decision. "Jamal Williams," he said formally, "you're free to go, but don't leave the neighborhood without informing us first." The crowd erupted in cheers. People hugged each other, cried with relief, and shouted praise for Mike's courage. Jamal slowly stood up, his legs shaky from kneeling for so long. His mother rushed to embrace him, both of them crying. But Mike wasn't celebrating yet. He walked over to Sullivan, close enough to speak privately. "Detective," he said quietly, "that kid is going to remember this day for the rest of his life. Make sure he remembers it is the day a police officer did the right thing, not the day he was almost arrested for being black." Sullivan nodded, shame and respect warring on his face. "You took a big risk here today, Mr. Tyson. What if this had gone differently?" Mike looked back at Jamal, who was surrounded by neighbors congratulating him and his mother. "Then it would have been worth it anyway. Some things are bigger than risk." The officers began walking away, but the real drama was just beginning. The crowd was energized, the media was arriving in force, and Mike Tyson had just reminded the world what courage looked like. The confrontation was over, but the impact was just starting to unfold. Within 30 minutes of the confrontation ending, the street corner had transformed into a media circus. News vans lined both sides of Fulton Street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Reporters thrust microphones at anyone willing to talk, while cameras captured every angle of the scene where Mike Tyson had made his stand. Mike found himself at the center of it all, but he wasn't comfortable with the attention. He had acted on instinct, doing what felt right in the moment. Now everyone wanted to know what it meant, what message he was trying to send, whether this was part of some larger movement. Mr. Tyson, called Sarah Chen from Channel 7 News, pushing through the crowd with her cameraman close behind. Can you tell us what motivated you to intervene in this police matter? Mike looked at the reporter, then at the camera, then at the crowd of neighbors still gathered around Jamal and his mother. It wasn't complicated, he said simply. I saw a kid in trouble, and I helped him. That's what neighbors do. But, sir, pressed another reporter from CNN, some people are calling this a confrontation with police authority. Are you sending a message about police reform? Mike's face darkened. The only message I'm sending is that we don't arrest innocent children because it's easier than doing real police work. That boy had proof he was in school when the robbery happened. The officers chose to ignore that proof. If standing up for facts makes me anti-police, then we've got bigger problems than I thought. The questions kept coming, fast and overlapping. What did this mean for race relations? Was he planning more interventions? Did he think the officers should be disciplined? Mike answered as best he could, but his attention kept drifting to Jamal, who stood with his mother a few feet away, looking overwhelmed by all the attention. Excuse me, Mike said, cutting off a question about his boxing career. He walked over to Jamal and Angela, the cameras following him. You two doing okay? Jamal nodded, but Mike could see the shock in his eyes. An hour ago, he had been walking home from school. Now he was at the center of a national news story. I want to thank you, Mr. Tyson, Angela said, her voice still shaky with emotion. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in. You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Williams. I did what anyone should have done. But they all knew that wasn't true. 50 people had watched the confrontation begin, and only Mike had stepped forward. That reality hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. A commotion at the edge of the crowd caught their attention. Detective Sullivan had returned, along with 2 men in suits who were clearly his supervisors. They were walking toward Mike with expressions that mixed official authority with obvious discomfort. The taller of the 2 men, Captain James Morrison, approached Mike with his hand extended. Mr. Tyson, I'm Captain Morrison, Detective Sullivan's supervisor. I wanted to speak with you about what happened here today. Mike shook the offered hand but didn't smile. What about it, Captain? Well, first, I want to acknowledge that you showed tremendous courage in defending young Jamal here. The investigation has confirmed that he was indeed in school during the time of the robbery, exactly as his mother stated. So the officers were wrong, Mike said. It wasn't a question. Morrison's jaw tightened slightly. The officers were following up on a legitimate report. However, they could have handled the situation with more sensitivity. Sensitivity. Angela Williams stepped forward, anger flashing in her eyes. They put my son on his knees in the street, like he was already convicted of something. They were ready to arrest him even after I showed them proof he was innocent. You call that a sensitivity problem? The captain looked uncomfortable, aware that cameras were recording every word. Mrs. Williams, I understand your frustration. We're reviewing the incident thoroughly. What's the review? Mike asked. Your officers received a vague description that could have fit hundreds of people in this neighborhood. Instead of doing actual investigative work, they grabbed the first black teenager they saw wearing common clothes. When presented with evidence of innocence, they chose to ignore it. If I hadn't intervened, you would have arrested an honest student for a crime he didn't commit. The crowd murmured agreement, and several people shouted support for Mike's words. Morrison realized he was losing control of the narrative. Mr. Tyson, perhaps we could continue this conversation privately. No, Mike said firmly. We'll continue it right here, where everyone can hear. This community deserves to know how their police department plans to prevent this from happening again. The second official, Deputy Chief Robert Hayes, stepped forward. Sir, while we appreciate your concern for justice, we can't have civilians interfering with police operations. There are proper channels for addressing grievances. Mike's laugh was sharp and bitter. Proper channels? You mean like the proper channel where Mrs. Williams showed your officers proof that her son was innocent, and they ignored it? Those proper channels. A new voice cut through the tension. Actually, Mr. Tyson raises an excellent point. Everyone turned to see Councilwoman Patricia Rodriguez approaching, flanked by two aides. She was a district's representative and a known advocate for police reform. Councilwoman Rodriguez, Captain Morrison said warily. Captain, she replied coolly, I've been watching the live streams of what happened here today. I have to say, I'm deeply concerned about what I've seen. She turned to address the crowd and the cameras. This incident highlights exactly the problems we've been trying to address in police-community relations. A young man with a clean record and a verifiable alibi was nearly arrested because officers made assumptions based on racial profiling and lazy investigative work. Now wait just a minute, Morrison protested. That's not. It's exactly what happened, Rodriguez interrupted. And if Mr. Tyson hadn't had the courage to intervene, Jamal Williams would be sitting in a jail cell right now, charged with a crime he didn't commit. His life would have been forever changed because your officers couldn't be bothered to verify basic facts. The crowd was energized now, feeding off the councilwoman's words. People began chanting, "Justice for Jamal. Thank you, Mike." Jamal himself looked overwhelmed by all the attention. Mike noticed his discomfort and put a protective arm around the teenager's shoulders. All of this talk is good, Mike said loudly, silencing the crowd. But what matters is what happens next. Jamal shouldn't have to become a symbol or a cause. He should be able to walk home from school without being treated like a criminal. He looked directly at Captain Morrison. Your department needs to answer some hard questions. How many other kids like Jamal have been arrested based on nothing more than vague descriptions and racial profiling? How many families have been destroyed because your officers couldn't be bothered to check basic facts? Morrison's face was red with embarrassment and anger, but he couldn't argue with Mike's points. The evidence was clear, recorded on dozens of phones and broadcast live to the world. We will conduct a full review, Morrison said finally. Good, Mike replied. And while you're reviewing, maybe consider training your officers to see young black men as potential honor students instead of automatic suspects. The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters scribbled notes and prepared follow-up segments. Social media exploded with commentary and debate. But Mike was already thinking beyond the moment. He had won this battle, saved this kid, made this stand. The question now was whether any of it would lead to lasting change, or if it would just be another viral moment that people would forget in a week. He looked at Jamal, still overwhelmed by everything happening around him, and made a silent promise. This wouldn't be the end of their story. It would be the beginning. 3 months had passed since the confrontation on Fulton Street, but the impact was still reverberating through Brooklyn and beyond. Mike Tyson sat in the community center that had become the headquarters for what people were calling the Fulton Street movement, reading through the latest stack of letters from young people around the country who had been inspired by what they had witnessed that day. The community center itself had been transformed. What was once a struggling facility with peeling paint and broken equipment was now a bustling hub of activity. Local businesses had donated money and materials for renovations. Volunteers came daily to help with tutoring programs, job training workshops, and community organizing meetings. At the center of it all was Jamal Williams, the teenager whose near arrest had started everything. He had grown more confident over the past months, speaking at events and helping other young people who found themselves in trouble with law enforcement. But he never forgot the fear he had felt that day, kneeling on the pavement while officers prepared to arrest him for something he hadn't done. Mr. Tyson, Jamal called from across the room, where he was helping younger kids with their homework. The reporter from the Times is here for the interview. Mike nodded and stood up from his desk, where he had been reviewing applications for the scholarship fund that had been established in honor of the Fulton Street incident. Over 200 students had applied for assistance with college tuition, vocational training, and educational supplies. The reporter, Marcus Washington, was a veteran journalist who specialized in criminal justice issues. He had been following the story since day one, documenting the changes that had rippled outward from that single moment of confrontation. "Mr. Tyson, thank you for taking the time," Washington said, setting up his recorder. 3 months later, what do you think has been the most significant outcome of what happened that day? Mike considered the question carefully. The most significant thing is that people stopped being afraid to speak up. What happened to Jamal happens to kids in this neighborhood all the time. The difference was at this time, somebody with a platform was there to witness it. And you've used that platform to push for real reforms. We've tried to, Mike corrected. The police department implemented new training protocols for interactions with juveniles. Officers are now required to verify alibis before making arrests based on general descriptions. The city council passed a resolution requiring body cameras for all patrol officers. These are good steps, but they are just beginning. Washington made notes, then looked around the bustling community center. This place has become a symbol of positive change. Tell me about what you're trying to accomplish here. We're trying to give kids alternatives, Mike explained. Jamal was walking home from school when those officers stopped him. He was doing exactly what he was supposed to do, getting an education, staying out of trouble, helping his family. But that didn't protect him from being treated like a criminal. Mike gestured toward a group of teenagers working on computers in the corner. These kids are learning coding and web design. Over there, we've got a group preparing for college entrance exams. In the back room, we're running a program that teaches young people their rights during police encounters. That last program is controversial, Washington noted. Some people say you're teaching kids to be confrontational with police. Mike's expression hardened. We're teaching them to protect themselves legally. We're teaching them that they have rights, and that those rights matter even when they're scared. If knowing your constitutional rights is controversial, then we've got bigger problems in police reform. The door to the community center opened, and Angela Williams walked in with her daughter, Jamal's younger sister Keisha. Angela had become one of the most effective advocates for police reform in the city, speaking at community meetings and working with other parents who had experienced similar incidents. "How's Jamal doing with all the attention?" Washington asked her. Angela smiled, but Mike could see the concern in her eyes. "He's handling it well, but it's a lot for a 16-year-old. Sometimes I worry that he's growing up too fast, taking on responsibilities that should belong to adults. But he's helping other kids," Mike pointed out. Last week, he talked a family through filing a complaint when their son was stopped and searched without cause. The week before, he helped a girl understand her rights during a school disciplinary hearing. He's turning his experience into something positive. "I know," Angela said. "I'm proud of him. I just wish he could have learned these lessons in a classroom instead of on his knees in the street." Washington turned back to Mike. "Critics say that your intervention that day was grandstanding, that you were using your celebrity status to interfere with legitimate police work. How do you respond to that?" Mike was quiet for a long moment, thinking back to that day, to the moment when he had to choose between staying safe and doing what was right. "Those critics weren't there," he said finally. "They didn't see the fear in that boy's eyes. They didn't see his mother begging officers to believe her when she showed them proof of his innocence. They didn't see 50 people standing around watching, afraid to get involved because they knew the system would turn on them too." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where it all began. A mural had been painted on the wall across from the community center, showing Mike standing protectively in front of Jamal, with the words "Courage is contagious" written in bold letters below. "I've been famous for 30 years, Mike continued. "I've had money, championships, more attention than most people ever dream of. But that day on Fulton Street was the first time I felt like I was using my platform for something that really mattered." "And what matters now?" Washington asked. Mike turned back to face the reporter. "What matters is making sure this doesn't happen again. What matters is creating a world where kids like Jamal can walk home from school without being treated like suspects. What matters is proving that when good people stand together, they can change things." Jamal approached them, having finished helping the younger students with their homework. "Mr. Washington, can I add something to your article?" "Of course." Jamal looked directly into the reporter's eyes, his voice steady and strong. 3 months ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I was going to jail for something I didn't do, and nobody was going to believe me. But Mr. Tyson showed me that there are people who will stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I want other kids who are going through what I went through to know that they are not alone, that their lives matter, that they have rights, and people who will fight to protect those rights. And what about the future? Washington asked. What are your plans? I'm still going to be an engineer, Jamal said with a smile. But now I also want to be a lawyer. I want to help kids who find themselves in the same situation I was in. I want to make sure they have someone fighting for them too. Mike put his hand on Jamal's shoulder, pride evident on his face. That's what this is all about. Not just fixing one problem, but inspiring the next generation to keep fighting for justice. As Washington packed up his equipment, Mike reflected on how much had changed since a hot summer day. The community center was thriving. Police procedures had been reformed. Young people were more aware of their rights. Families were more willing to speak up when injustice occurred. But perhaps most importantly, people had been reminded that individual courage could spark collective change. That standing up for one person could protect countless others. That sometimes the most important battles were fought not in boxing rings or courtrooms, but on ordinary street corners where ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things.